Good morning. How are you all doing? Are you excited? We're so excited. Thank you all for being here. Before we start, I just want to really quickly acknowledge the sponsors, without whom it would not have been possible to have you here with everything that we're doing for just $20. Thank you to you all for contributing those $20 to help us with the spending restrictions on food and other things that we have at the moment. I think it's going to be nice. I hope everybody already had like some coffee and stuff. There will be more of that throughout the conference. To just give you a quick roadmap, you're here right now in Pembroke Hall. This is where we're going to have the talks and where we're going to have coffee. By the way, if you want to skip breakfast tomorrow morning, we'll have treats with the coffee in the morning, so you can have some of that. I think that's the plan. I'll double check that. And then, in case you got confused, so this is the two entrances in Pembroke, and I've indicated with arrows to the left and right where you will either find elevators or stairs. So if you come from the green on the ground floor, then the stairs are on the left and the elevator is on the right. And if you come from the street, it's going to be the other way around. But since you all found your way here, I assume that you figured that out. Just in case you missed the stairs, that's where they are. Okay. Our request for anybody who is speaking is that you come up to us in the break before you talk so we can get you sorted on the computer so we don't have any delays. And then we'll make sure that you can present everything all right. And then for those of you presenting posters, both posters and lunch are going to happen in Sales Hall. That's just a 5-minute walk to the main campus, so you get to see that too. And all of what I just told you should be in the program, which is linked on the website. We have the QR codes all over the place, so you can download this for yourself. Some of you may require Wi-Fi to do that, so you can either use, if you're not local, you can either use the Brown Guest Network, or if you're in one of the institutions that support that, you can also just use EduRoam, depending on what does and doesn't work. So hopefully we got you all covered with that. And then tonight, you should all have a drink token in your name badge. We're gonna meet up at Hot Club. I recommend that you take the scenic route along the river from here when you go there. It is possible to have dinner at Hot Club if you like finger food and sandwiches. If you prefer to have a prepper dinner, you can go out for dinner and then just meet us there afterwards. Does that sound good? Yeah. Awesome. Huh? So anytime between 6:30 and whenever you trickle in, you can just get there. They're prepared for us to arrive anytime between 6:30 and 8:30. Yeah? Cool. All right. There's a whole range of other people without whom this would not have been possible. Our official committee, you can see here on the screen. So I have been helped tremendously by Joe, Ohad, and Haley, who you will get to know as researchers a little bit better in just a second. They're going to tell you a little bit about what they're up to. And then, of course, Matt, who is our local host, and then Jackie and Tully. Some of you will probably have emailed with Jackie because we made her invite all the speakers. Cool. So thanks to all the organizing team. Towards the end, we will also thank some of the people who provided local support. For example, without Pat from Brown Neuro, we would not be sitting here. Okay. Are you ready? Then we're going to go and have our first session. We will start with a couple of short organizer talks. This is the order of people on the website, but we're actually going to scramble that up. So we're going to start with Ohad, and then we'll have Haley, and then we'll have Joe present. And then we'll have our first invited talk with Tully Sherritt, and then we'll do blitz talks, and after that, we're going to scurry over to lunch. Does that sound good? Amazing. Let's do it.
Hi, everyone. We really are excited to see you all. It's nice to see old friends and to make new friends. And I think that when we were thinking about this, we thought it would be nice to grow a community. I think we all meet at different conferences, and we see these topics come up, and we are all interested in them. And we thought it would be nice to have an event where we can all focus on this and then grow a community around it. So here's one place for us. We have people from many different disciplines that use different methods. So mingle, talk, think together on new collaborations. This is a great opportunity to think together about these topics that we all cherish and like and think are interested. And I'll start today by talking about a psychological approach to curiosity. And it's what I'll focus on. This talk will be only on curiosity, and looking forward for the rest of the conference to speak about curiosity and information-seeking exploration. But today, I'll speak about curiosity. And if I had to define curiosity shortly and informally, I would say that curiosity is information approach motivation. And one way that we would measure, quantify it, and experiment is present participants with some questions. Say, what are undersea researchers doing to explore the ocean floor? And then we would ask participants to rate how much they're interested in learning the answer to this question. And I think that this framework makes sense. It makes sense in the sense that it is intuitive to think about curiosity as a one-dimensional factor, something that goes between not feeling it at all to feeling a lot of it. And I want to challenge this framework by presenting to you a two-system psychological model of curiosity, specifically a hot-cool model of curiosity. But rather than telling you about this, I want to show you and ask for your help. This is going to be an interactive first minute. So when I look at this question, what are undersea researchers doing to explore the ocean floor? I look deep inside and I ask you to look deep inside and see what kind of curiosity do you experience. I want to know the answer to this question. I would see a documentary that answers this question. I would read a paper answering this question. I feel one type of curiosity. But how about this question? What's the single English word that has 3 consecutive double letters? I'm intrigued by this question. I would click this link. I would flip the trivia card. I wouldn't know the answer to this question. But when I look deep inside, I find that this wanting, this information approach motivation is a little bit different. And I want to color them and present to you a few more examples. When I look at this question, what explorer wrote the famous reply poem to Christopher Marlowe's 1599 poem, The Passionate Shepherd to His Love? I look deep inside and I find that I feel none of these curiosities. And when I look at this one, what can I learn in 1 week that would greatly improve my life? I feel both. And now I want to do an exercise and ask for your help and see if you share these intuitions with me. When you look at this one, what's the color of the White House toilet paper? Where do you think this should go in these two-dimensional axes? Bottom left? You're not interested at all. Okay. Anyone else? That's fair. Yeah. This is what I and most of the participants we had thought about this. This was the same kind of curiosity. How about this one? What Australian city's basketball team was called the Devils. This is what most of our participants thought when here. They don't care about, sorry, Australia, but no, these are our participants. And last one, what do you think about this one? Why don't space rockets take off from a plane already in the air? Makes so much, it's already up there. What do you think? Where should this? What? But there are rockets that take off from a plane already. Great. So where would you put this question? Well, we all learned something new, but yeah. Another thing you can do here. But yeah, like someone from the audience suggested, this is what most of our participants thought. And what I'm going to do in the next 5 minutes is tell you about how we sought to find some behavioral evidence for these two-system model of curiosity. And the way that we did this by repeated choice between 2 options, where we combined one question that had a very high factor of this type, White House toilet paper, and the other one was high on the space rockets factor. And we hypothesized that these questions would be preferred at the present, and if we delay the decision or its outcomes, we would find that the participants would prefer these kind of questions. And we find evidence for this in 4 pre-registered experiments. And I'll tell you what I think this could mean to the way that we, or perhaps only I, consume information in our modern technological world. A very influential paper in cognitive sciences, it talked about hot and cold cognition. This paper, it described a 2-system framework where we have one cool system that is cognitive and strategic, and the other is hot, a hot system that is emotional, it's driven by fears, and it's impulsive. And when you read literature from the last few decades on curiosity, you find similar way of speaking about curiosity. You find one stream about the research of curiosity. They describe curiosity as a cognitive process that's goal-directed, that depends on amount and value of information, and it promotes memory and learning. And you find another stream of papers that describe information as an emotional, impulsive feeling that's like an urging each to know. And we thought it would be interesting not to think about this as one thing, but to divide these two and call them, name them as the 2 different factors of curiosity. And we named them interest and urge. Interest is a cool factor of curiosity. When I read this question, how does the placebo effect work in the brain? I want to know the answer to this question. And this type of knowing we would call interest. And when I see this clickbait, they showed up wearing that. You won't believe what happened next. I would click this clickbait and I would experience information approach motivation. And this kind of motivation, this kind of curiosity we call urge. And we thought that these 2 factors feed into one feeling of curiosity, but that these factors have different underlying dynamics, specifically temporal dynamic. We thought that interest, these cool factors, are more stable in time, whereas urges are more focused on the here and now. And so we predicted that they would decay in time. So our model thinks about, curiosity as a feeling with temporal dynamic that decays in time, but decays more for urge. So when we ask how much curiosity does someone experience, it depends on the time since exposure to this informational stimulus. And we see that both decay, but questions that are associated with cool factor decay more slowly. And this may give rise to an interesting phenomenon if we compare these 2 items. If we ask our participants which of these 2 questions would they prefer seeing an answer to, if the question is at the present, at time 0, this question would raise more curiosity than this one, the blue one. But if the decision is delayed or revealing the answer is delayed, then the rate of decay of the orange question, the one high on the hot factor, would decay more, and this question would raise more curiosity and perhaps chosen more. This is exactly what we sought out to test. And we did this by collecting a large set of questions and doing the same exercise that we've done together, asking participants to place these questions on these 2 dimensions. And we paired these questions such that in each question pair, one question had a lot of urge and a little interest, and the other a lot of interest and little urge. And we asked participants to simply choose between them. We presented participants with a set of 2 questions, one after the other, and we told them which one would you prefer learning the answer to. What's the color of the White House toilet paper? Or how have families changed over time? And whatever you choose, you'll find the answer right now. And we found some distribution across participants and questions. And then we repeated this experiment exactly, but told participants that they would find the answer next week. And what we found is an increase in the likelihood of choosing these questions. So on this axis, the 1 means choosing the blue questions, the cool factor all the time, and 0 means choosing the orange question all the time. And we repeated this in 4 different settings. We asked participants to make a choice or to rate when the answer was revealed right now or next week, or right now but with some delay. And across these experiments, we found a robust increase in the likelihood of choosing the high interest question, the one associated with the cool factor of curiosity, when the decision was delayed. To summarize, we had a hypothesis about 2 types of curiosity, one that is hot, which we call urge, and the other is cool, which we call interest. And we hypothesized that they have specific dynamics in time where urge decays more quickly, And we found evidence supporting this. They're consistent with this hypothesis, where when choices were at the present, participants preferred the high urge questions, and when the choices were delayed, they preferred the high interest question. And when I think about how I consume information in the real world, I like music and arts and sciences, but if you would observe the way that I consume most of the information in my free time, I end up watching endless streams of 20 seconds videos. And if you would judge whether I feel curiosity or not, I would say that yes, I approach this information, I experience some motivation to consume this type of information, but I don't know if I'll say that I'm really interested in them. But one thing that I can do, and if you have similar experiences, you can also do, is put these things that you want to consume, that you feel curious about, put them aside, and maybe the curiosity associated with them that may be driven by urge. So next time you see an urgy clickbait, you can tell yourself that you'll read it, but later, put it aside, and perhaps by the time you'll get to it, the curiosity associated with it will decay, and you'll leave yourself being able to focus on the information that you're really interested in. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of this great conference.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to tell you about a very new project today, so just some preliminary results, but hopefully I'll leave you with some hot curiosity. So typically when an animal is considering whether to either approach or avoid something, the behavior and the outcome are valence congruent, right? So in other words, an animal is typically motivated to approach positive things and avoid negative ones. But this isn't always the case. There's many circumstances where both approach and avoidance can be exclusively negative or aversive outcomes. So let's say, for example, you get a headache. There's a potential for that headache to be indicative of a really bad outcome, maybe a serious illness. Typically, people with this type of worry engage in one of two strategies. So they either avoid getting information about that aversive outcome, or they might engage in approach behaviors, things like researching symptoms on the internet or repeatedly visiting their doctor. So our overarching question for this study is how and why do people differ in their decision to either engage with or avoid aversive or threatening information? So if we return to our example here, some people might feel worse not knowing what's wrong with them, so in other words, when uncertainty is high, and someone else might feel worse knowing their diagnosis, in other words, when they're exposed to this negativity. And so it seems important to consider not just the valence of a goal or an outcome, but also how things like uncertainty and affective experiences modulate these behaviors. So we can consider an alternative model where both approach and avoidance behaviors are not motivated by rewards and punishments per se, but are instead motivated by the mitigation of unpleasant affect. And in an attempt to mitigate unpleasant negative affect, people might be more or less likely to care about whether they'd like to either reduce uncertainty or reduce their exposure to negativity. And we're hypothesizing that these different strategies will lead to differences in approach and avoidance, with the desire to reduce uncertainty leading to approach and the desire to reduce negativity leading to avoidance. So we developed a task to look at how people decide whether they want to gain knowledge about something threatening. And during the task, we also collected pupil and eye gaze data to measure emotional arousal and attention dynamics. I won't talk too much about that today. So I'll walk you through the task so you can get a sense for what our participants are doing. So participants are told that they'll be put in different environments. Those environments switch back and forth throughout the game. Some environments are threat environments, some environments are safe environments. Participants don't know for certain which type of environment they're in until the end of each block of trials. In a threat environment, they get a small electric shock to their wrist at the end of that block of trials, and in a safe environment, nothing happens. We tell them at the beginning of the study which types of images will represent shock environments and which types of images represent safe environments. In this example, images of faces represent shocks and images of houses represent safety. So on every trial, participants can choose either to receive information about the environment or choose to skip. If they choose to skip, they avoid seeing any information and simply see a blank square. However, if they choose to get information, they see a morphed and potentially noisy image of a face and/or a house, which I'll explain more in a moment. They have 5 trials to decide whether they want to get or skip information about a particular environment. And during those trials, they can do whatever they want. They can skip every time, get information every time, or a combination of both. If they choose to get information, the information never gets better or worse. It stays exactly the same. And the decision to either choose or skip information has no impact on the ultimate outcome, so it's completely non-instrumental. After getting feedback, we ask participants to indicate their belief in the likelihood that they're either in a face or a house environment, and we also ask them to rate how confident they are in that likelihood estimate. After 5 trials, they're shown a clear image of either a face or a house. If they're in a shock environment, they get a shock after a delay. If they're in a safe environment like I'm showing here, nothing happens and you just move on to the next. So the key here is that on each block, both the environment changes, so whether you're in a safe or a threatening state, but the information quality also changes. And the information quality can differ in a couple of different ways. So we visually manipulate information uncertainty across 2 dimensions. Information likelihood, which is the extent of that morphing between face and house image, and information noise, the magnitude of static in the image. And these combinations make up our experimental conditions, which are repeated for an equal number of safe and threat blocks. And I'm just showing you a subset of our condition combinations here, which I've also made easier to distinguish just for illustration today. So on the top left, you can see an example image with higher levels of information noise, but high likelihood of the outcome being a face. So in this case, it might be that regardless of that high noise, it's still pretty easy to tell that there's a high likelihood that you're going to end up in this face state, which would end in a shock. On the lower right, you can see what we have, appears to be an equal likelihood of being in a face or a house environment. So despite a low amount of noise, I might have a lot of uncertainty still about whether I'm going to receive a shock or not. We recently finished data collection for this study, and our analyses are still ongoing, but I'll share just a few results with you today. So I've already talked about how we're manipulating what we're calling information likelihood and information noise. Information outcome is whether the block is ultimately safe or threatening, so the actual outcome that you receive. And outcome proximity is how many trials away you are from that outcome. And we think that all of these factors might contribute to the decision to either approach or avoid information, and that we might see individual differences in the weighting of these different components. So we can look at the proportion of times that people choose to either seek or avoid information, and we can look at how this proportion changes as a function of the information likelihood, or what I'm going to call informativeness, as well as a function of the information noise. So here I'm showing you that proportion of information seeking split by informativeness and noise aggregated across all our participants. And we can see that people are likely to seek information in conditions where the total uncertainty is high, so when there's high noise and low informativeness, compared to conditions where that uncertainty is low, so low noise and high informativeness. And we can also see that there's a difference between these top rows on the left and right-hand panels where informativeness is high, so in other words, you know fairly well which environment you're going to end up in. You will choose to seek out information more when you know you're going to be safe and avoid it more when you know you're going to be shocked. We can also look at behavior during other parts of our tasks. So for example, when people are judging the likelihood of being in the safe or the threatening environment, or when they're indicating their confidence in that judgment, which we consider a sort of proxy for their estimate maybe of the noisiness of the environment, or at least that's what we hypothesized. It's actually not what we see. So if we look at patterns in these subjective ratings of confidence and likelihood split across all of our conditions, on the top we have our average confidence judgments, which show an obvious pattern of higher confidence as informativeness increases, but actually no pattern across noise levels. In general, people don't tend to care so much about that noise, it seems, at least not on the aggregate. And then on the bottom are just mean likelihood judgments, which show that participants are generally making accurate judgments about the informativeness level based on those visual manipulations. We can also look at people's responses to actually receiving either a safe or a shock outcome at the end of every block, and that can tell us how they're perceiving this actual threatening information as well. So one way to determine how people are feeling in these threat or safe contexts is to look at pupil diameter, which is a readout of the neurobiological stress response. So here we can see that when people find out that they're in a threat environment and are about to receive a shock, they have significantly larger pupil diameter than when they find out they're going to be safe. And these are, again, aggregated results, but in the future, we're going to look at individual variation in this readout, and that's one of the things we're actually really interested in. So we can see how differences in the magnitude and dynamics of emotional responding is associated with these other aspects of behavior in our task. Also, we asked participants to simply tell us how anxious they feel. So here I'm just showing that we do find robust differences in subjective negative affect between our safe and our threat conditions. But of course, there's individual variation there too. Finally, we can also look at how people's behavior changes depending on how close they are to finding out what environment they're in. So here on the left, you can see this overall downward slope where people are decreasing their proportion of information seeking over time as the outcome gets closer. But you can see that when we split this up by noise on the top and informativeness on the bottom, it seems that this choice behavior doesn't differ between noise conditions, but it does differ between levels of informativeness, with people seeking relatively more for low informative conditions, even as they approach a final outcome. And then this plot on the right is just showing that we've started to also see individual differences in this behavior, with the majority of individuals seeking less over time, so each of those lines is an individual, but some individuals seeking more over time. So what I've shown you so far, again, is mostly aggregated data across all of our participants, but what we're really interested in doing next is starting to describe the individual differences that we see. So just to give you a quick taste of that, we also had participants fill out a battery of self-report measures, and we found so far that anxiety and depression-related constructs are associated with increased information avoidance during threat blocks compared to safe blocks. However, we see this interesting opposing pattern in sensation seeking, with people higher on sensation seeking actually seeking more information in threatening environments. And I don't have time to talk about this today, but we're continuing to clarify this variance using clustering techniques and other methods. And we're also testing a novel computational model so that we can quantify these different components of uncertainty and information and test whether our hypothesized cognitive process actually matches behavior that we're seeing in our data. So I'll stop there and quickly thank my collaborators and funding sources and all of you for listening.
So yeah, thank you so much everyone for being here. It's really exciting to be at the start of this conference, and I can't wait to hear about all of your research. I'm going to take the opportunity to tell you a little bit about the work that we've been doing at Birmingham, thinking about how people seek information when it's about other people as well as themselves. Okay, so there's been a lot of amazing research done on how we choose to seek information or not when it affects us, a lot of it by people in this room, and across different species. Two factors that have been shown to be really important, as Hayley already mentioned, are valence and uncertainty. So we're thinking here, I mean, maybe you would think the outcome of your grant, will be something that changes your behavior, but I'm interested, in these decisions to seek information where we have no ability to change the outcome, there's no instrumental utility. And so we know that people seek this kind of information to resolve uncertainty. So if you really didn't know which way this outcome was going to go, and then also to seek positive information. So if you thought that there was quite a good chance that this was going to be good news. But of course, we also make decisions every day to seek information or not about what's happening to other people. So maybe I message to say that I've heard back about my grant, and you could also find out or not about the outcome. So to look at this experimentally, we've adapted this task based on previous research. So like Hayley talked about, people are going to make this binary choice, whether to seek information or to avoid it. And the way that we manipulate uncertainty and valence here is with these 9 cards on each trial. So the colourful cards are going to be that the outcome happens. So this outcome is that you're going to get 10 credits. So if colourful cards are in the majority, that's going to happen. If the grey cards are in the majority, nothing's going to happen, so no credits for you. But the white cards to start with are the ones that are hidden, so you just don't know what's going to be under there, and that's the information that you can seek or not. So those different combinations of starting kind of colourful cards, grey cards, and white cards make up our uncertainty and valence manipulation. And then we also have a cost if you want to seek information. So in this version that I'm showing you first, there's a small time cost. So if you want to know, you're going to have to wait either 2, 4, or 6 seconds to find out, or you can just take no time at all and move straight on to the next trial. And then, of course, the final thing that we want to manipulate is whether the outcome is for you, so the self-condition, or whether the credits are going to add up into the bonus payment for an anonymous other person. And we've done these studies online and in the lab, and so we tell people that it's another participant who knows nothing about what you're doing today, but your decisions are going to be about outcomes for them. So participants will make that choice on each trial. They'll either wait the few seconds and find out the outcome or not, and move on to the next trial. I'll just make that smaller because then we want to have this information-seeking task as our main focus. But to be able to really isolate what's going on in relation to information seeking, we have a second task that captures how people value the outcomes for the other person and themselves against the same cost. So in this example, they're going to choose in this second task whether to wait to actually gain a number of credits extra for themselves or the other person. And this is, we know based on a lot of our previous work, that people value things for themselves more than other people, so we want to be able to capture this. And having these two tasks together, we fit them into the same computational model. And this allows us to have this kind of K parameter that captures how they devalue rewards for themselves and the other person by the cost. So that's based on both tasks. And then by kind of controlling for that, we can really kind of isolate these weightings on their uncertainty and their valence, how much those are important for their information-seeking decisions. Okay, so we've done this behaviourally in quite a few different samples now. So the first thing we wanted to do is establish that both between participants and within the same group of participants, we have good reliability. So we did these big online samples, and the second sample did the study twice, about a week apart. And so our first main finding, as we expected, is that people are more interested in what's happening for themselves compared to this other person. But on average, they are willing to wait a few seconds to find out about credits for someone that they don't know they will never meet. This was very reliable in our second sample as well. And then when those people did the study a week later, we again found good reliability. There's a bit of a collapse to the floor where a few people thought, this isn't actually that interesting, I'm just going to skip on every trial. But generally, I think I was surprised that not everyone did that, basically. People are, obviously more interested in themselves than other people, and then we want to think about why this is the case. So if we plot these decisions based on the uncertainty and the valence as manipulated by the sort of card draws, we find that these factors are important for both self and other, but they're more important when it's about ourselves. So those lines are steeper in purple compared to the other person. And this also comes out in the computational modelling. So as I said, we want to sort of control for how people value outcomes for themselves and other people by this sort of discounting model. And so that's what we capture here. People, the lower values here show that they value those outcomes for themselves more than the other person. They devalue more for the other. But we also find a difference in how they're calculating the uncertainty. So this is a bit different to just the weighting parameter. I'm not going to go into that, but I'm happy to chat more about the sort of uncertainty models that we're using. And again, with valence, we find that whether it's going to be positive or negative is more important when it's about ourselves. So then we wanted to, again, sort of replicate this as part of establishing the task. And this time we changed the cost. So now we want to see whether people are willing to exert effort to gain information. So the same task, but just apart from the change that instead of waiting a few seconds, if they want to seek the information, they're going to have to click online lots of times. And this level of effort is going to be thresholded to their maximum. So at the start, they click loads of times as fast as they can. And then they're going to have to, as indicated by the bar, exert 10, 30, 50, or 70% of their maximum on each trial. And they'll, if they want to seek the information, they'll see the bar fill up in real time and then get the information if they successfully click enough. So again, we sort of replicate all of the findings, and we see that people are more interested in information for themselves. And this is driven by uncertainty and valence, particularly here valence. So uncertainty seemed to be kind of equally important for self and other, and it was more the sort of valence effect that was even stronger for themselves. And then the final thing we wanted to do, as Hayley just talked about, obviously it's really important to think about how we seek information when it's about bad news, so not getting nice credits, but getting electric shocks instead. And I think particularly for the sort of social outcomes is these maybe that we might just avoid what's happening on the news when we think it's going to be really horrible for other people. So here we did another kind of version of the task. To start with, there's no cost because we really didn't know what people were going to do. Maybe they always avoid bad news. So we took out the cost aspect, and we had rounds where it was a nice thing, so here a token, which we thought sounded more exciting than a credit for some reason. We made that switch at this point. Or they're going to get an electric shock, and the same for the other person. So this data was collected by my research assistant, Meghna, and what we found was actually a very surprisingly similar pattern of overall interest between the two outcomes. So for both good news and bad news, I'm more interested when it's for me, but to quite a similar level. And generally, people are sort of seeking the information about the shock, not just kind of wanting to stay completely ignorant. We also found it was a surprisingly similar pattern for the effect of uncertainty. So like we'd seen before, uncertainty drives information seeking, and this is really similar depending on the sort of rewarding or aversive domain. But then the difference came when we looked at the valence effect. So again, we found what we had before, that the valence is sort of even more important when it's for me. I really like good things for me, not surprising maybe. But with the shocks, they were actually more interested when the other person was highly likely to get an electric shock rather than less likely, whereas obviously for themselves, they wanted the good news a bit more. Okay, so a lot of this has kind of been, developing the task, showing the replication and everything. So now we're ready to move on to the more interesting stuff in the next projects. So we're going to look at these effects over the lifespan, which is data I've already got, and also individual differences, so how do trait measures link to these things. We're then going to take the version with electric shocks and tokens into joint MRI and MEG to look at the kind of neural trajectory across space and time. We're going to see how dopamine manipulation in a healthy sample with an L-DOPA affects these patterns, and whether that sort of valence effect in particular is driven by dopamine, as has been shown before. And we've also got this really exciting collaboration to look at patients with deep brain stimulation in the basal ganglia, where we can also record from those electrodes and see what's going on there. So to thank all of my collaborators across all these different projects, sort of past and future. And if you're not done with conferences for the year, a quick shout out for my colleagues who are doing a foraging conference in Birmingham if you want to come and visit in November. Thank you.
Our first invited speaker is Tali Sharad, and I'll just leave the stage to you.
Thank you, Romy. And thank you for the organizers. They did an amazing job, really, behind this. We'll see it in front of us, but so far what you didn't see is quite amazing. So, okay. I'm going to talk about knowledge systems, which we all have in our mind, which are representations of different concepts and the relationship between them. And what I'm going to show you today is that humans are naturally inclined to seek information that makes these systems more efficient and more useful. So there is an infinite amount of information in the world for us to absorb from other people, from technology, from just walking around in the world. And once we process this information, we call it knowledge. And it makes intuitive sense to think that we probably evaluate the different types of information so we can go back to people and places that give us valuable knowledge. But what makes information valuable? To start thinking about this question, let's play a little game. I'm going to show you a sentence and just think about how much you like it. So, a pizza cutter is great for chopping up herbs. Just think about how much you like it. There's another sentence. Think about how much you like it. Ancient Egyptians used bread as currency. So now I'm going to give you a choice. Do you want more information like A or more information like B? Who wants more information like A, the pizza cutter? Okay, we have a few, great. Who wants more information like B, ancient Egyptians? Okay, so usually scientists choose B, which is not surprising. But I was happy to see a few hands up for A. Doesn't usually happen. Okay, so I purposely chose two pieces of information that are very different on where their value is coming from. So information A, you can actually use to change your actions in order to change the external environment to get rewards. Information B, you're unlikely to use it to guide your actions to change the external environment, but it does change your internal environment. It changes the way that you think, the way you understand the world around you. So we're going to call the type of value A, extrinsic value, and the type of value B, intrinsic value. Sometimes people call the extrinsic value instrumental value and the intrinsic value non-instrumental value. Now, to make it clear, a piece of information can be high, very high on both intrinsic and extrinsic, can be very low on both, any sort of combination. Kind of think of it like sugar and fat. So you can have a cake that's high sugar, high fat, a candy, just high sugar, and so forth. So it's not binary. And there could be a piece of information that we consider to have only intrinsic value at this point in time, but maybe later on, it turns out it has some extrinsic value. And in fact, I think that every piece of information will have some intrinsic value. Okay, and so this is what we're going to do for the talk. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to share some data that suggests that indeed we use these high-level components of value to evaluate pieces of information. I'm going to talk about the neural representation of these components. And then I'm going to ask, what is the adaptive function of these components, and specifically the intrinsic value. And this is where I'm going to show you that, in fact, intrinsic value represents the ability of information to make our knowledge system more efficient in a way that we can quantify. And the last thing I'm going to show you is tools that we developed that can be used online to search the web in a way that makes it easier for people to find information that fulfills both their extrinsic needs and intrinsic needs. Okay, so let's start with the first question. To try to figure out how people value information, what we're going to do is simply look at the two behavioral signatures of value, which is liking and wanting. I'm going to ask people, how much do you like it? And make choices between pieces of information. To try and think about what are the features that are associated with the value of information, we looked at the literature on value, not just value of information, just value in general. We looked at philosophy, psychology, economics, neuroscience, and just how people use the term just every day. And so here's an example of a definition of value. So it uses words like benefit, importance, usefulness. And so looking at all this literature, these are the words that came up again and again when people talked about value. So usefulness, beautiful, interesting, familiar, meaningful. So in this first study that was conducted by my PhD student, India Pinhorn, she had two samples. One was in the scanner, one was home in Prolific. And what she did is she gave them pieces of information, and they read the piece of information. They said how much they liked it. So we have 60 different pieces of information. Then outside of the scanner, they looked at all these pieces again, and they rated them on these different features. And then they made choices. Do you want more information like A or more information like B, also outside the scanner? On Prolific, it was very, very similar, but the order was a bit more mixed up, just so we can generalize it to different orders of how you do things. So the first thing we're going to look at these different ratings, and we're going to say, well, these ratings look like they are very different, but maybe there are commonalities. Maybe they're representing common factors. So we're going to do a PCA to try to identify these common factors. And then we're going to see whether these common factors predict value. Are they going to predict liking and choice? So entering the ratings into a PCA analysis, we found that most of the variability in ratings could be explained by two main components. The first component explained about 40% of the variability, and it had high loadings on meaningfulness, meaningfulness, beautiful, interesting, and low on usefulness and familiarity. The other component explained about a third of the variance, and it had very high weights on usefulness and medium to low weights on the rest. So we labeled the first component intrinsic and the second component extrinsic. And so what we're going to do is, and on the left it's from the fMRI and on the right from prolific. So what we're going to do is we're going to see whether these two components predict value, and indeed they did. So they predicted both liking and choice. So pieces of information that were rated higher on the intrinsic and extrinsic value were more liked and were more likely to be chosen. Again, I just want to highlight that this is not binary. So you could have information, it's not that a piece of information is in the blue bar and another one is in the green bar, okay? Remember the sugar and fat. And the other thing that I want to highlight here is that both of these components predict value. It's not only one. This is going to be important in a minute. Okay, so the first thing we're saying is it seems to be these two high-level principles of the value of information. Extrinsic value, is it useful? Can I change my extrinsic environment? And intrinsic value, things like meaningful and beautiful and so on. So the second question was, how does the brain represent these different components? Do they represent it in a dissimilar manner or in the same manner? So we know quite a bit about how the brain represents the value of material things. We know less about how the brain represents the value of information. What we do know comes from tests that look something like this, and almost all of them have been done by people here in the room. And if you look at the task, you see a few very interesting things. First of all, these experiments that look at the value of information mostly look at information about future outcomes. Am I about to get a lot of money or a little bit of money? Am I about to get a lot of water or a little bit of water if it's non-human animals? And so we're not asking, what is the value of the semantic information that we're interested in now. And part of the reason is that a lot of this work actually emerged from work in non-human primates. And you can't really ask a monkey, do you want to know about ancient Egyptians? And the second interesting thing, if you look at these different studies, is that all of them, with one exception that I will talk in a minute, they look at non-instrumental information. So information that I cannot use to change my outcomes. And most of the talks today was also about non-instrumental information. The one exception by Ming and Kobayashi did look at information that could be instrumental, but when looking at the null representations, they didn't distinct between the two. So what we do know is that the intrinsic value, the non-instrumental value of information is represented in the reward system. This has been shown again and again and again. Okay, so here's a question that we're going to ask. Is the value of semantic information, the type of information that you and I are exchanging today, is that represented in the reward system? And is that true both for extrinsic, i.e. instrumental information, and value, not information, and also for intrinsic value? Coming into this, our hypothesis was yes, that both of these will be represented in the reward system. But to our surprise, the answer was no. What we found is that it was the intrinsic, but not the extrinsic value that was represented in the reward system. So what you're looking at here in blue is regions in the brain where the bold signal is correlated with the intrinsic value of information when people read sentences. So you can see that in the reward system, very clear, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex going into the striatum. And in green are the regions where bold activity correlates with the extrinsic value of information when we're reading pieces of information. The brain does represent extrinsic value, but not in the reward system, at least in our hands, but more in this higher associative regions. And we get the same thing, it doesn't matter how we look at it. Whole brain analysis, ROI analysis, controlling for stuff, we always get the same thing. So from this so far, it looks like there are two value components that are distinct, both in terms of neural coding and behavioral influence. And it is the intrinsic, but not the extrinsic value that is coded within the reward system. And our question for the next question is kind of why? Why would the reward system represent the intrinsic value of information, and what is the adaptive value of this? So back in 2020, together with Cass Sunstein, we wrote a piece where we talked about the different components of value of information. And we said there's 3 real functions that we can see, and based on the literature that exists. The first is instrumental value, like I said, extrinsic. And the other 2 functions are related to the intrinsic value. And the one function that we talked about, one of them was, well, the intrinsic value may be to what we called improve our mental models, which basically means improve our knowledge systems, make it stronger. And we said, well, people would want information that makes the system stronger. What kind of information makes a system stronger? We said, well, maybe things that reduce uncertainty, that fill in knowledge gaps. Indeed, people in this room have suggested the same, have shown that it's true. We also said, well, maybe you want more information about core concepts in your model, things that are activated more and are related to many other concepts, because maybe more information about that will strengthen the knowledge system. And again, there are studies showing that people do want more information about these core components. We also said, well, maybe you don't want disconfirming information, because disconfirming information will weaken your structure, will cause breaks. And indeed, there's many studies showing that. But this was sort of not very satisfactory, because we don't have a formal and parsimonious way to say what makes a knowledge system stronger. Is there a way that we actually can quantify this? So then Rafael Kuczynski joined my lab as a postdoc, and he said, well, actually, there's a huge literature that we could use to quantify the strength or the efficiency of a network, right? We can look at network theory. And if you look at network theory, you can see that many networks in the world, whether they are man-made, biological, or social networks, they usually look like what's known as small world structures. Small world structures are very efficient. And what characterizes these small world structures are clusters, as well as these shortcuts between clusters, these highways that connect very distant clusters. And we can actually quantify how much a network resembles a small world structure using this index. It's called the small world index, which basically is equal to the clustering of a network. The clustering of a network is how many of my friends are friends with my friends, so creating these triangles, divided by the length. So if I'm flying from London to New York direct, that's 1. If I have to stop in Paris, that's 2. So the average length in the network, the smaller, the better. And I can divide that by the clustering and the length of a random network. So if I have my network with just random connections, I can calculate cluster and length. And it turns out that the knowledge system also looks like a small world structure. So this is data from the Diane and Storms. And what they did is they gave people words, and they just asked them, what is the next word that you can think of? And based on that, they showed, and other people have shown this as well, that the knowledge system also looks like a small world structure. So let's think, why is it helpful for our knowledge system to be a small world structure? Well, let's start by imagining that it was random. Every node will be related to every other node in a random manner. Well, that just really doesn't tell me much. So if I know something about a horse, I can't infer a lot about a cow. However, if I start clustering my concepts, now if I know something about a horse and even a chicken, I can then infer something about a cow. It eats and breathes and all that. Great, this is much better. But I don't know how these animals are related to fields, for example. So it's really helpful to start connecting the clusters in a meaningful way. And that's also great. But what's also helpful is to have these shortcuts between different clusters. For example, I can connect the horse with a train they are both enabling to take people and cargo from one place to the other. And the reason this is helpful is that now the probability that I will go from a bird to a horse to a train is enhanced, which then leads to this new concept that I didn't think about before, which is a plane. So in other words, small world structure of a knowledge allows us categorization, generalization, and innovation. Okay, so we have our knowledge structure, and we're going to put in a new piece of information. I'm going to connect these two concepts with my new piece of information. That changes the efficiency of my knowledge network, which I can calculate. And I can put another piece of information, and that will also change the efficiency of the network in a different way. And I could look at these two small world index, and the question that I'm going to ask, do people prefer information that makes that knowledge system more efficient? Are they going to like it more? Are they going to choose it? To do that, the first thing I need to do is I need to create the knowledge network. We decided to do it in a more automated way. So we took all the concepts in all the sentences that we had. So I think that's about 160 or so, maybe more. And then we added another 660 concepts that are both frequent but also distinct. So now we have 860 concepts to build our knowledge network. We took the Wikipedia entry from all of these concepts. We fed the Wikipedia entry into an algorithm that we took from Hugging Face. This is an embedding model that basically is designed to take the Wikipedia entry and to give us a vector. So now each concept is a vector, and we can calculate the cosine similarity between the two vectors of each concept. So now we have a matrix of 860 by 860, and now we could take this matrix and build a graph. Okay, so now we have our network. In this network, every node is a concept, and the connection between two nodes is based on the cosine similarity of these two concepts with some kind of threshold that decides there's an edge or there isn't an edge. So now that we have this, we can calculate our small world index. Great, so that's a small world index of our knowledge network. Now I want to make it clear that, of course, I don't think that my knowledge network is the same as yours, but turns out it's a good baseline number that we could use. So now I'm going to put in a new piece of information that will give me a new small world index. And the difference between the two tells me how the network changed. Did it become more efficient, and to what degree? And what we're going to do is, for each piece of information, we're going to calculate this. And now we're going to see whether people do like and choose pieces of information that enhances their efficiency of the knowledge network. And the answer was yes. We replicated this quite a few times. I'll show you replication in a minute. But people do choose and like those sentences that make the knowledge system more efficient. Not only humans do this, LLMs do this as well. We did not look at LLMs because we think LLMs have preferences. That's not why. But we think LLM represents the preferences of humans. So it's a really nice way to generalize beyond our sample. And we replicate this. So this study was Rafael's study, but we also replicate this on India's sentences that I showed you before, seeing the same thing. And here's the important part. It was the intrinsic value, not the extrinsic value, that was related to the efficiency of the knowledge network. So in other words, intrinsically valuable information increases knowledge network efficiency. Okay, so the suggestion is that the adaptive function of intrinsic value, when things feel interesting and meaningful, partially they increase the efficiency of the knowledge network. The other third function that I told you about, I don't have time to talk about it today, but the third function is this intrinsic value enhances mood and mental health. And we have a study on that. And the last thing that I will say in the few minutes that we have left, I'm going to tell you about this tool that we developed to help people, when they go online, find information that fulfills their both intrinsic and extrinsic needs. So to build this tool, we were inspired by nutrition labels. So if you go to a supermarket and you want to choose which bar to eat, you can look at the label, and it tells you how much calories or how much fat is in that bar. So if I'm on a diet, I might choose low calorie. If I'm about to run a marathon, I'll choose high carbohydrates. But when you go into the supermarket of content online, there is no guidelines. So we thought, well, maybe we can produce one. Imagine that every time before you click on a link, it tells you whether the information there is more likely to be positive or negative. On average, how likely it is to enhance your knowledge. On average, how likely it is to be actionable, to guide your actions. In order to do that, the first thing we need to do is to develop a machine learning algorithm that could do this for us automatically. And so to do that, we had a few thousand people rate a few thousand web pages on these 3 dimensions. We then fed that into a machine learning algorithm, and we test the machine learning algorithm on the held out data. Our machine learning algorithm does quite well, so about a 0.6 to 0.45 correlation between the algorithmic score and the human score. Again, what makes me feel positive doesn't necessarily make you feel positive. What enhances my knowledge is not going to enhance yours. However, this is a nice baseline score that is relatively consistent across individuals. It's like going on Amazon, looking at scissors, and some people like the scissors and some people don't, but there's like a rating that is informative. Now we took these algorithms and we put it in a plugin, and if you download the plugin, which you can by using this QR code, every time that you Google something, you will get the Google results, but also these scores next to each website. So for example, I put in how to make brownies, and what you can see is that the web pages that I get are very positive. They are very actionable, but not going to enhance my knowledge much. And on average, the first link is better than the second. A few months ago, I put in university budget cuts. I got links that are very negative, will enhance my knowledge a lot, but unfortunately are not actionable at all. So we tested this. We gave people this plugin to use, and we compared what they do with it versus when they browse without it. With the plugin, they're more likely to consume information that is actionable in knowledge, no effect on emotion. As a side point, when we just give them the emotion label, they use it. But when it's together with actionable in knowledge, it is ignored. But people do say they feel better after using the plugin versus not. They say that they feel that they consumed information that's more knowledgeable and actionable. And the last thing I will tell you is, we also have an app which you can also download on either Mac or Android, which tracks the consumption over weeks or months. So this is data from Edward, who's working on this app, and you can see that Edward consumes more positive information on the weekend. And in general, his information consumption is not bad. He has nice knowledge, nice actionability. But that allows you to look at your own consumption. For the app to work, you also need to download the plugin, just so you know. Okay, so to summarize, we suggest that the value of information is a combination of its ability to positively influence your extrinsic and intrinsic outcomes. These 2 value components are distinct, both neurally and behaviorally. It's the intrinsic, but not the extrinsic, that is coded in the reward system. We think the adaptive function of the intrinsic is to enhance efficiency of the knowledge system, as well as to impact mood and mental health in a positive way. And you could use the tool, if you like, also for research, by the way. And just to acknowledge dozens of MIT groups who worked on the plugin and the app. It was developed by Chris Kelly, who used to be a PhD student in the lab, Edward, who's working on it now, and Eva Lash, who just joined the lab. The efficiency study was done by Raphael as well as Amber, who's here somewhere. And the fMRI by India and Bastien, who used to be a postdoc and now is a professor in the Sorbonne. And just to also acknowledge Ethan and Caroline, who are also sitting here, who were part of our first studies that kind of started this program in the lab, I guess. Yeah, thank you. And I do think we have a few minutes for questions.
Hey,
Do I? Yeah.
okay. Hi, Tali. Great talk. Thank you. I wanted to ask you about that SWI metric. Why do you call it efficiency? And can you say a little more? Efficiency with what goal?
Yeah,
relative to what utility?
it's used as a term as efficiency. It's like how fast can information on average move from one point to the next, right? So that's in general any network, whether it's transportation, whether it's a social network, like one of the networks that I showed you is like emails within a company. So the idea is for information to move from one node to the next. Now, when it comes to the knowledge system, what does that mean? I think what it means is, like, I don't have a good definition for you, but I think it means something along the lines of the things that I talked about before. Inference, generalization, right? If these, like a horse is very close, if I can move a horse to a chicken in an efficient manner, I'm more likely to infer about the chicken from the horse. That's the idea, of to make connections that also can then lead not only to generalization, but also to novel ideas. So I don't have an answer, but like, what does that mean biologically in the brain? And it's all new. I don't know, and it will be really interesting to figure out what that actually means.
Yeah, and also to make it psychologically relevant, it seems like different people would, I want faster information transfer between some topics, and you want faster between other topics. And so, right, it's
So
not overall.
our huge hope, and as Rafael is especially the one who's driving this, we would love to have the knowledge network of each individual.
Yeah.
And so it's super hard. We're doing some of it now, but our shortcut was to use just, the method that we did, and it turns out that it works for this. But
Yeah.
yes, that is the next, and in fact, he's already doing studies with that, using both lots of behavioral measures, not all of them are working, and then also trying to look at bold signal to try to use that, because you could use that as well to try to kind of map that as well.
Okay. We have, let's start there.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. I was wondering about a broader notion of actionability here. So in your small world network, you have all of these nodes with different weights competing with each other. And when you describe, I forgot the intrinsic versus extrinsic, I kind of categorize this as pragmatic versus epistemic sorts of value here. Pragmatic versus epistemic. And the disambiguation between different nodes competing for some particular, path, right? That in and of itself would be the thing that's actionable there, like for your intrinsic category, right? So, yeah, go ahead.
So if I'm understanding correctly, you're asking, why is it that the SWI is not related to the extrinsic component, to the actionability? Is that what you're saying? Like, it should also...
Yeah, well, yes, and I'm kind of offering that the intrinsic category is playing that role of disambiguating these competing nodes of, like, uncertainty across your small world network. If you categorize your intrinsic rather as an epistemic sort of value, and the thing that it's trying to resolve is just the competing weights between a particular path between your nodes.
I don't know if the weights are necessarily competing. So I'm not, like, biologically you may think that's true, but in the actual network, the way we set it up, there's no competition. But maybe biologically we think about it. I haven't talked about it that way, but in our setup, there's no competition. And in terms of epistemic, to me, epistemic doesn't necessarily mean intrinsic, right? So if I know that I can use this pizza cutter to cut herbs, I think that's epistemic knowledge. So I think all the sentences that we have are epistemic to the same degree.
Okay.
If we look
yeah.
at the definition of epistemic, the way that we use it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll leave it there.
That would be interesting.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Wait, what? Oh, okay. Sorry, right.
Great. Thank you. That was a really lovely talk. Something I was curious about with regard to like this knowledge network stuff is how aware we are of what people in network science would call structural holes that basically are the opposite of small worldedness in a network. And so if I am aware that there are some number of concepts that could be connected to each other, but I am also aware that I don't know how they're connected, right? This is now like a meta level piece of knowledge that I have about what I don't know. And the context in which I'm curious about this is like avoidance. So there are some things in my knowledge network that don't activate one another. And I would prefer to keep it that way. I would prefer not to think about all of the horrible things that are happening in the world when I think about like whatever, some university funding, let's say, right? And so I'm curious if you've studied like how people represent their own knowledge without like accessing the contents of the knowledge itself.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of stuff there, but the one thing that we are super interested in is whether the same framework can explain information avoidance. And like, for example, we had the hypothesis that I mentioned is disconfirming information will make your knowledge weaker. We want to actually test that. Like, can we actually quantify that and show that avoiding disconfirming information is because it makes the knowledge system more efficient, not necessarily more accurate, but more efficient, and that could explain that. And so if you think of, for example, on misinformation, it could be that misinformation that's very viral actually makes the knowledge system more efficient, and that's why it works. How it relates to valence, I don't really, haven't thought about that yet. I don't see a connection, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but I have to think about, does it relate to the valence, positive or negative? Tell me when to stop.
With 3 minutes over, we can maybe take one more question, and then we'll do blitz talks.
I'll make it super fast then, if I can take over. So, super great talk. Very, very quick thing. You very briefly mentioned, oh, you can't do this in monkeys. But monkeys will, they love to look at videos of other monkeys, right? Especially if it's to do with the social hierarchy. And so that just in general, and again with this bread example, I'm like, okay, it's not got a sort of extrinsic value to me, but I could imagine a social value to me. And I wonder if you've thought of this with respect to social versus non-social.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I didn't mean that you really can't do any of this in monkeys. I agree.
Yeah.
Social versus no social. I don't know if it will, I mean, I think from what I understand that Joe showed us is that social and non-social basically uses the same principles, right? That's my takeaway. So I don't know if it's going to matter. I think
guess it doesn't.
Like everything will be true.
It doesn't come out as another factor then, social. You get two factors out of your first factor analysis.
And we also have a study actually that shows that, well, this is sharing information, it's not quite. That even the same principles that you use to seek information, you use the same principle to the same weight when you decide whether to share it with someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, very cool, thanks.
Okay, if I could then please ask the Blitz Talk speakers for this session to come up.
Not quite, but come towards the front. We're going to do a video first for
Okay.
this person who's talking.
All right. Please line up. We're going to start with a video for somebody who unfortunately had to not come last minute.
Hi, my name is Lou. I'm a developmental and comparative psychologist at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. The need to deal with an uncertain world has been proposed as the key adaptive pressure leading to complex cognition and behavior. One key tool to cope with an uncertain world is the ability to adaptively explore it. Here we see chimpanzees in Kenya exploring the location of a snake. Explorative behavior depends on the property of the environment. Humans and other animals engage in more exploration, unpredictable and complex environments, and adapt their exploration strategies to the environment. However, the biological evolutionary roots of human adaptive exploration remain poorly understood. One way to tackle the evolutionary origins of adaptive exploration is to compare whether chimpanzees' exploration strategies are similar to those of humans in important respects. The idea is that if we find similarities between human and chimpanzee exploration, These similarities are likely to be adaptations to respond to risk and uncertainties in the environment. Chimpanzees are an ideal reference for humans for this endeavor because they're one of humans' closest living relatives. Previous studies investigating exploration in non-human primates have mainly focused on whether or not subjects search for a desired object, rather than how properties of the environment influence exploration. In order to study how chimpanzees explore their environment, we adapted the decisions from experience paradigm established in research on risky choice in humans. And in this paradigm, subjects face two options, both representing an initially uncertain payoff distribution. They're told anything about the properties of the options, but are allowed to explore them. And they are encouraged to explore the options until they feel confident enough to decide which option is better. Here in this study, we investigated whether environmental change prompts chimpanzees' exploration and with which strategies subjects implement the explorative behavior. I collected all data during 3 months of fieldwork at Sweetwater's chimpanzee sanctuary in Kenya. 15 chimpanzees were tested in a within-subject design involving two conditions, a stable and a changing environment. The setup consisted of 8 small black trays, a safe and an uncertain option, each comprising 4 trays. In the safe option, each tray was baited with a quarter of an apple. In the uncertain option, 2 trays were baited with half an apple and 2 trays were empty. So chimpanzees began with no knowledge but had the opportunity to learn about the possible outcomes and their frequencies by drawing random samples from each option. Chimpanzees were free to uncover one by one all of the trays before making a choice for one option. One tray was then randomly drawn from the option chosen, and the chimpanzee obtained the respective reward or no reward if the tray chosen was empty. The experiment involved 2 conditions. In the stable condition, the safe and uncertain option stayed on the same side of a trials, and the same trays in the uncertain option were baited with food. In the changing environment condition, the safe and uncertain option changed sides over trials, and the baiting of the trays in the uncertain option changed. So first we looked at the general exploration effort. In line with previous studies, we see that on average chimpanzees explored about half the trays per trial. And given that exploration is associated with actual cost, limiting exploration can be rational. So this finding is also in line with studies showing that humans typically explore little. Yet on the right side, we see that there were notable inter-individual differences. Next, we investigated whether environmental change prompts chimpanzees' exploration. So first, we investigated whether chimpanzees explored more in changing than in stable environments. We have exploration on the y-axis and the number of trials on the x-axis. The model estimate for the interaction between condition and trials was negative, suggesting that over trials, chimpanzees explored changing environments more than stable ones. The uncertainty around the estimates is likely due to the marked inter-individual differences in exploration. Next, we investigated which strategies chimpanzees exhibit to implement the explorative behavior. So given 2 options, at least 3 explorative strategies can be used to explore them. Subjects can explore only one option. When choosing to explore both options, they can explore from one option and then switch to the other option, or they can explore them piecewise by switching back and forth between the options. So we found that in changing environment, there was a clear preference for exploring only one option, whereas in the stable environment, exploration of one option and sequential exploration were used equally often. So in the changing environment, exploring only one option will continuously lead to surprises, and this results in line with previous findings, suggesting that if expectations about a specific option are violated, explorative behavior about that specific option is promoted. So focusing on one rather than multiple options can thus enhance learning in the changing environment. So taken together, we found that chimpanzees explore adaptively. Specifically, we found that environmental change prompts chimpanzees' exploration, yet with marked inter-individual differences. And second, our results suggest that chimpanzees adapted the exploration strategy to the environment. Taken together, these findings suggest that key dimensions of behavior under risk and uncertainty, like more exploration and changing compared to stable environments, emerge independently of the influence of human cultural evolution and thus may have deeper phylogenetic roots than previously suspected. Here you can scan the QR code to read our paper, and there's also a video of the setup available. Thank you.
Okay, if I could then please ask the Blitz Talk speakers for this session to come up. Perfect. Please take it away. Awesome. Thanks. So my name's Madeline Klotz, and today I'll be presenting some evidence out of our lab at the University of New Hampshire that shows evidence for an explore-exploit trade-off in information search. So the world is full of endless possibilities to learn, but the specific situations that we're interested in are ones where you're searching for information, you have multiple sources of who might have the answer, but you're uncertain about which source is going to give you the best information. So based on prior research, we propose that behaviors in these situations are guided by an explore-exploit trade-off. This proposal is mainly rooted in the fact that these signatures have been found in contexts with explicit rewards, and since there's ample evidence that we treat information as rewarding, we think we might see some of the same patterns arise. So these ideas led us to our overarching research question: is there an explore-exploit trade-off in intrinsically motivated exploration, such that people balance maximizing information gain against learning how to explore effectively? And so to test this, we built an online study where people had to make choices between maximizing information gain and learning how to explore effectively. So we did this by adapting an exploration task from previous research, but this time, rather than searching for rewards, people were searching for information. We started by providing two sources of information, the buttons. One button always provided more information on average than the other, and buttons were novel on every trial. When participants chose a button, we gave them a chunk of information displayed in this box, and in this case, the information being gathered were chunks of pixels in an image. We also provided participants with a record grid that housed previous choices and showed the horizon, or how many future choices they had left. And the number of pixels, or amount of information gained on each choice, was housed in that record grid. So higher numbers or higher chunks of pixels indicated higher amounts of information. So participants would choose, participants would go through the trial by choosing different buttons, and as they gathered more information, they would guess what the image was before moving on to the next trial. So here is an example of it all in action. There's the two buttons representing the information sources. As you choose buttons, you gain more information in the form of pixels. The record grids are telling you how many choices you have left and holding all of your historic choices, and then you guess what the image is before moving on to the next trial. So one signature that's found in prior research is directed exploration. So again, you can see the interface here where a participant has made the first 4 choices. And as you can see, one source has been chosen more than the other, creating more uncertainty about one of the choices, in this case, the pink button. So what do you choose next? You could exploit by choosing the button with the higher observed mean, or you could explore by choosing the button that you're more uncertain about. And sometimes those things converge, and the more uncertain button is also the button with the higher observed mean, like in this case with the pink button. But when they don't converge, like if we move some of the amounts of information around and make it such that the uncertain button now has the lower observed mean, you're then forced with a decision of whether you want to maximize information gain and choose the higher observed mean, or if you'd rather learn more about the uncertain button and learn how to explore more effectively. So then a second signature found in prior research is random exploration. Again, you can see the interface here where a participant has made the first 4 choices, but this time the sources have been chosen equally. So you can be equally certain about the quality of both sources. So in this case, what might you choose next? Again, you could exploit by choosing the button with the higher observed mean, or you could behave randomly and choose the lower observed mean, which probably isn't intentional, but rather the result of noisy decision-making, which is labeled as random exploration. And so we found evidence that people do balance maximizing information gain with learning how to explore effectively in this new domain of intrinsically motivated exploration, based on finding those signatures of both random and directed exploration. But another piece is that in the explore-exploit literature, there is a horizon effect that shifts these patterns of exploration. So we wanted to know also, do people explore more when there is more time to explore later, to exploit later, or a longer horizon? So if you want to hear more about what we found in that case, so sorry. Could you hear anything I said? Okay, cool. So if you want to hear more about what we found, you can find us at our poster later today after lunch.
Hello everyone, I'm Ruksan Gopnaran. I'm a PhD student at University of Hamburg, and I study interactive decision making. So to give an example of interactive decision, imagine you are going with a friend to a supermarket and you want to choose between two products now. So there is one product which is organic but expensive, and there is another one which is cheap but not organic. You yourself don't care so much about the organicness of the products and would then rather just pick the cheap one. But how do you know what your friend wants? So one thing to do is to just ask them. But choices are sometimes deceptive. People might say something just to please you, but that not reflect their true preference. So another information which you could use is their response time. So when you ask someone a question, say you want an organic or the cheap one, and then say, oh, I want the organic one very quickly, that would imply that they really care about the organic one. But if they hesitate, that would basically imply that, they maybe don't care about it so much. But there is one more thing which you can use is their gaze. So there is this attraction search effect where if you like a particular item, you tend to look at it more. So now me as your friend can follow your gaze and from your gaze try to figure out what product you want. And this has been explored quite extensively for how people could learn from choices. Recently, there has been some work from how you could learn from their response times, but there has been almost no work from how you could learn by following someone else's gaze. And to work on this, we created this multi-attribute bargaining task. So the idea of the task is that there is one participant who is a seller and another one who is a buyer. And the seller wants to sell you, for example, cars. And each car will have 3 attributes, and the 3 attributes will have a score from 0 to 100. So if the score is 100, that means that product is really good in that attribute. So you can see that this particular product is a fast car. It has a good speed, but is not so comfortable, is not so safe. And so the seller makes this offer, and the buyer can only accept or reject these offers. And this happens in the real time. The seller makes the offer, the buyer sees it, and they accept or reject. So in a way, we are conveying the response times indirectly without explicitly saying that, okay, they rejected in 2 seconds. They just see it in the real time. But while this is happening, the seller can always see what the buyer is seeing on their screen. So when an offer is made, the buyer sees the offer on their screen, but also the seller can see the buyer's screen. And one interesting thing what we are doing is we are tracking the eye movements of the buyer, and we show the eye movements of the buyer to the seller on the seller screen using a red cursor. So the seller can always follow where the buyer is looking at. And we don't only do this for cars, we have different categories, and the preferences across the attributes would change across these categories. And there are 2 groups. So there's one group which has access to these eye movements, and the other group which doesn't have access to these eye movements. And the goal is to compare these 2 groups. But now how me as a seller could actually figure out your preferences? So what could be like one possible model for this inference? So one idea is that, okay, me as a seller, I made this offer previously. It was a fast car, but you rejected this offer. Now what it tells me is that, okay, maybe you don't care so much about fast cars. And so then I could update my belief. So hence we are using like this Bayesian belief updating framework, where the idea is that, okay, you have a score for 0 to 1, where 1 will say that, okay, this attribute is really important. So you could have one hypothesis like H1, which says that, okay, you really care about speed, hence it is 0.8, but you don't care so much about safety and comfort. But another hypothesis could be that you care a bit about safety, a bit about comfort, and not much about speed. And now you can sort of intuitively see that H1 is unlikely, but H2 is more likely. And you can then expand on this framework for all attribute weights. So rather than just considering like 2 combinations, you can consider like say 100 combinations of these attribute weights, and then you could learn from their choices. And in this work itself, we also created a model for not only learning from choices, but from response times and also gaze. And if you want to learn more about it, please come by and visit my poster. And I thank you for your attention.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think that was an amazing first session. This concludes our first session, and I invite you all to come along to Sales Hall, where we're hopefully already having lunch served. We thought that it might be good if the poster presenters stopped presenting 10 minutes early, because you have to walk back here, and it would be really great if we could start on time at 2:45. Can we do that? Since the lunch and the posters are in the same hall, you can basically start presenting whenever you feel like it. Yeah? Amazing. See you soon.